Continuing on then, we look at the first chapter, which has been entitled The Human Condition, and there's an introduction to each of those chapters, and so I wanted to just point out a few of the things that the Bodhi had to say about the human condition and the particular texts that he selected to include here. And so he talks about the Buddha's teaching originating as a response to what he calls the strains at the heart of the human condition. And that his approach to this is being very direct, being very thorough and uncompromising in terms of the realism that he looks at these strains. And he talks about facts of everyday experience, growing old, being sick, and eventually all of us die. And he also includes an ethical point of view as a part of this, and so we will see elements of various parts of what we refer to as Buddhist ethics that are included in many of these examples. And the idea is to help guide us to turn away from unwholesome ways of living. The very definition of ethics has to do with what's right or wrong, good or bad, and of course our opinions about what are included in those vary somewhat, but those are the important things that we talk about. And many of those are fairly consistent. For example, the 5 precepts that we talked a little bit about last week go back to ancient times, prior even to the Vedas, and then the Brahmins used them as a part of their practices in the Vedas and so forth for lay practitioners. And so the Buddha had his unique view of those that we talked about a little bit last time as well, where he kind of expanded the meaning, the definition, to look at them in more of a way of looking at our own sensory kinds of experiences that we have. And so, for example, where it talks about intoxication, it's not just intoxication with alcohol or with drugs or things like that, but it's intoxication with our sense pleasures that we have, and we begin to develop a sense of attachment to those, or in some cases aversion perhaps. And so he had a broader approach to including those very basic ideas in terms of ethics. So he had concern for our own long-term wellness and happiness as a part of that, and he wanted to point out that our actions have consequences, which is basically the idea of karma. So this is subdivided into several different sections with examples in each of those, and so the first section here has to do primarily with aging and death. And here he compares the upper strata of society with various liberated arhats. And then he takes our task in life to live righteously and do wholesome and meritorious deeds is another one of these. The third one is about when we fail to recognize what he refers to as divine messengers, people that are, or examples that are sending us ideas about how we should behave, and whether we're paying attention to those or not, or we miss these hidden warning signals in the things that are going on around us, and as a result we become negligent or behave recklessly in our life. So we need to realize that we grow old and die, and that breaks the infatuation over sense pleasures, wealth, power, and so forth. So wholesome actions lead to a pleasant rebirth and bring future well-being and happiness. So this is the main theme of what he's trying to address here related to the human condition. The second section has 3 aspects of human life, and he refers to them in terms of types of suffering. And here he compares the ordinary person with the wise follower of the Buddha. And so the one who is untaught and the one who has been taught. The instructed noble disciple is the term he uses for that, and the uninstructed worldling is the other one. So the first text in this particular collection is a response to painful feelings. And so he here makes a comparison of something that is painful in the body versus our aversion to those and having a painful mental feeling that results from that and tends to endure. So we need to address those. But he says pain doesn't need to trigger that. And so things like misery, fear, resentment, and distress through mental training, or as we often say in our Buddhist tradition, training the mind. And so much of this is about training our mind and helping us overcome what might otherwise cause us a great deal of pain, whether physical pain or mental pain. But the primary focus here is on the mental pain, if you will. Another aspect that he talks about here are the 8 worldly conditions. These are 4 different pairs of things that go to one extreme or another, and so those are gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. So the worldling is elated by success, achieving gain, fame, praise, and pleasure, and dejected by their opposites. And so the noble disciple is the one who remains unperturbed by these things, dwelling in equanimity and not being attached and not being repelled. No attachment, no aversion. The next text talks a great deal about change, and specifically in the context of the 5 aggregates, form, feelings, and so forth. And so all of those things, and addressing that in terms of our focus on ourselves, me, my, I, mine, so forth. And so change can cause a lot of anxiety and stress in our lives, and also in terms of our social interactions that we have with others. A lot of these things have to do, ethics itself has to do with how we interact with others. If there were no others, ethics would be totally irrelevant. But it's how things are right or wrong in terms of our interactions with others. They can lead to violent confrontations and conflict and so forth, things like greed and hate. So the idea is to the Buddha offer people a refuge from those kind of things, from the violence, the injustice, and so forth, and placing an emphasis instead on loving kindness and compassion. The third section then talks more about the roots of violent conflict and injustice. What do these things come from, if you will? And the need for inner change. We have to make these changes within ourselves. We have to change our mind, the mind training, in order to establish any form of peace and social justice as a part of that. It starts with ourselves, and in terms of ourselves, it starts with our mind. The causes are our mind. And so the first text in this one talks about conflicts between lay people and ascetics. First between lay people due to attachment to our sense pleasures, and ascetics because of their attachment to particular views of things. That's a very brief text. And then there is also hatred and enmity to envy and niggardliness, or being cheap. There's a chain of causation in the third one related to a feeling for craving and other conditions that arise that eventually can lead to violent behavior. And he talks about the 3 roots of evil in the fourth one, looking at basically the 3 poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion, and having terrible repercussions as a result of those things. Then there are transformations of society. Those require changes in the moral fiber of individual human beings. So it starts with us. We have to change ourselves before we can change anything else. We become the role model, the example for others, which is one of the best ways that we can share our belief system, our practices, and so forth, is by doing it as a role model. We become a Buddha, and people see our behavior and they are more inclined then to follow that. The fourth set in this particular chapter on human condition has to do with rebirth and the bondage of being bound up in samsaras. We go through these cycles over and over and over again. And so he refers to this as the idea of directionless wandering. We're just going about, we have no particular direction, and we just wander around in samsara and create these same problems over and over and over again for ourselves. And so he says we never find an initial moment of creation as a part of this. Now this is fairly unique to Buddhism. We don't see this in other religions. They have creation stories. Almost every religion has creation stories, and as a part of that they have a creator, usually a creator God. And so Buddhism is fairly unique in not having that quality. The texts 1 and 2 deal with our mothers and fathers across world systems. In addition, not only is this process beginningless, but it's also potentially endless. Samsara just keeps going as long as we're caught up in that with our attachment, aversion, and our delusion and so forth. So this is above all the defining criteria or crisis of the human condition, and we're bound to it through our own ignorance and our craving. And it goes on for eons, and so one of the things that is brought up here is how long is an eon, and he gives a description of that, and the incalculable number of eons that this continues. We wander and roam about from life to life and fall again into this process of birth, aging, and sickness and death, and the craving just kind of propels us forward through this process. Most live immersed in sense pleasures, others in power, status, and esteem. Many are fearful of death. They construct belief systems and so forth, and have with the prospect of an eternal life. But very few yearn for the path of liberation. And so the Buddha came in order to offer us such a path. So that's the story here in this particular section. So we'll take another little break here.